All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third of 3 community online workshops for short-term rentals. The purpose of hosting this online is to balance the health risks associated with the coronavirus while appreciating the public's input in a transparent and open manner during the current state of emergency. The public will not be able to physically attend the workshop. As a result, the city is hosting this online workshop as an opportunity for people to provide comments, feedback, and/or questions. My name is Nick Brandt, and I will be hosting this workshop with my colleagues, Karen Pan, Colin Ogle, and Lieutenant JJ Puglisi. We greatly appreciate your time and your commitment to serve your community, especially during the current situation. Karen, Colin, and I work in the Community Development Department, while Lieutenant Puglisi works in the Police Department. While we are tasked to design proposed regulations for short-term rentals, our main goal is to work together with all of you to ensure that we are building a safe, beautiful, and thriving community in Burbank. And please bear with us if we experience any technical difficulties. Tonight's workshop, which includes a presentation by staff as well as a period for questions and answers with participants, is scheduled to last for an hour and a half. Tonight's presentation is also live on YouTube. It will be recorded and rebroadcasted on the city's TV channel. As noted, you will have opportunities to share your input. There is a Q&A feature on the bottom of your computer or cell phone screen. At any time during the presentation, please type your question by clicking the Q&A icon. Answers to the questions from attendees during the workshop will be posted on the city's website during the following days. During the workshop, there will also be times where we pause to see if anyone has comments or questions. When that time period is available, we will ask you to click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. If there is not enough time, please make sure to provide your questions and comments in the Q&A icon. Those that are speaking will have a maximum of 2 minutes and will only be able to speak once due to time limitations. And we can mess around with that if need be. At any time, even after this workshop, you can contact Karen or myself. We will be providing our email addresses and phone numbers at the end of this presentation, and they are also available online. For tonight's agenda, we'll start with a short background of why we're here and the steps we've taken so far on this process. Next, we'll discuss our enforcement processes, and we'll touch on how we're currently enforcing against short-term rentals and what our proposed enforcement mechanisms will entail. After that, we'll give a high-level overview of our proposed regulations. Throughout the course of this presentation, we will be providing time for the public to ask questions and provide comments. And we'll close out with our next steps. Short-term rentals refer to renting out a housing unit in whole or in part for 30 days or less. Based on staff and consultant research, it is estimated that there are approximately 400 to 500 listings in a given year in the city with an occupancy rate of approximately 33% or 1/3. We are far along in our policy development process. We started out with a study session at a June 2020 City Council meeting. We held 2 community workshops, one in July 2020 and one in September 2020. And in between those 2 workshops, we sent out an online survey. In December, we presented our proposal to the city's planning board, who voted not to recommend the proposed regulations and requested that staff do more public outreach for more understanding of what the city's wants and needs are on this issue.
So when it comes to the proposed regulations for short-term rentals, there's 2 levels of approvals for the proposed regulations. The first, it would go to planning board, which is what Nick was describing. Planning board is the advisory board to city council related to land use topics. And then depending on how they vote, whether they want to move forward or not, that information is then relayed to City Council for a final vote on the proposed regulations. So what happened at the last planning board meeting, it was back in December, the planning board voted to not move forward with the recommendation to have proposed regulations for short-term rental and to allow it as well. And the reason why planning board decided to make that recommendation, it was because they wanted to get a more understanding of the code enforcement piece, as well as do additional community outreach to understand the regulations a little bit more and to also get community feedback on it. And throughout this process, just like what Nick describes with the community workshops and the survey, there's other additional clarifications that we're trying to get from the public, and we greatly appreciate you being here today. And it has to deal with business license cap and hosting information, and we'll get to those 2 points later on. But that's definitely what we heard from planning board, and through the community feedback, we understand there's a need to understand more about city enforcement. What are we doing today, and what are we doing with the proposed regulations if we were to move forward with it? Next slide. So right now, our proposed regulations states that in terms of enforcement, there's tiers of notice of violation. The first offense being $1,000, the second offense being $1,500, and the third offense being $2,000, and up to 12 months of suspension or revocation. And then afterwards, if there continues to be notice of violation, then the legal ramifications would happen afterwards. So that's how our proposed regulation is currently written. And now we want to talk about what are we doing today, and how do we respond to issues related to short-term rental. And we've broken it out by different tiers, after hours and daytime hours. And Nick, if you go to the next slide, I'll have Lieutenant Puglisi describe what we currently do related to complaints with short-term rentals after hours.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Lieutenant J.J. Puglisi from Burbank Police Department. So the way that we would manage an after-hours complaint related to a short-term rental is much the same as the way we would manage any disturbing the peace complaint that comes into the police department. Typically, a call is going to be generated from someone in the community that's having an issue with a neighbor that's making too much noise or somehow disturbing their peace, and they would call the normal non-emergency number for the police department at 818-238-3000. Once they call that number, our communications center operators are going to take that call, they're going to enter it into our dispatch system, and they will send out officers, which is usually a minimum of 2, to handle that call for service. Typically what happens when officers respond out to one of these calls is that they're going to issue some type of a warning. Unless it's something that's really blatant, they're going to issue a warning to the person first, and most of the time that's sufficient to satisfy the call, and we don't have to respond again. If it requires a second response out to the call and it's something like a party, then we would typically issue what's called a notice of disruptive gathering, first notice. And that's a formal written warning that advises the owner of the property or the person in charge that if we have to come out again, then it could potentially carry fees associated with our response. Like I said, it's typically a warning's given first prior to that, but if we go out and it's a party that's out of control, the officers are most likely going to issue that first notice up front. If we have to return a second time, Then the officers would issue a notice of disruptive gathering, second notice. And with that, the property owner is billed for the police response to the residents. If it's a large party, if it requires the airship, then they're going to be billed for the airtime that helicopter had to be there to assist us in stopping the disturbance. So with that being said, each call is unique. Officers obviously have discretion to handle the call as they see appropriate under the circumstances, and short-term rentals would really be no different except for the caveat of if we were aware that it's a short-term rental and there were obvious violations, then officers would be able to document that in a report for licensing code to follow up on at a later time. With that, I will hand it over to code enforcement.
Hello, my name is Colin Ogle. I'm a senior inspector in code enforcement, and I'll be going over the current ways we address short-term rentals in the city of Burbank and potential code enforcement practices that can be adopted by the city in conjunction with the proposed short-term rental registration. Currently, short-term rentals are enforced by the city when a complaint is received. Due to the lack of evidence that can be observed to identify short-term rental properties, code enforcement relies on neighbors to let us know when there is a possible short-term rental on a property. When a complaint is received about a possible short-term rental, the property is researched online on the most used host websites, and the short-term rental locator maps on these websites are utilized to attempt to pinpoint the general location of the alleged short-term rental. If there is evidence found on a website that the property in question is being rented short-term, a notice of violation letter is sent to the property owner. Further enforcement may include a notice and order sent to the property owner, administrative citations, and the case may be sent to the city attorney's office for review to determine further enforcement if necessary. So on the next slide, this shows the additional resources that would be available in the proposed program for short-term rentals. So these resources include a third-party consultant that provides identification of the properties that are advertised as short-term rentals online so that the property can be registered or enforced on if necessary. The proposal also includes a direct communication with host platforms so that the host platforms can remove unregistered properties from their website. Additionally, there would be a designated representative for each short-term rental property, which would be either the owner or owner's representative who would be immediately available to respond to issues that may come up on the property. There would also be a dedicated inspector for the proposed short-term rental program who would receive and investigate complaints related to short-term rentals. They would also coordinate resolutions to violations occurring on these properties. And lastly, there would be some assistance from the police if needed on inspections related to disturbances by the short-term rental properties. So on to the next slide. These next two slides show the proposed registration process for short-term rentals. Third-party consultant would oversee the initial registration process for short-term rentals in this proposed program. The process would start by having the consultant identify all of the existing short-term rental properties. Then connections would be established with identified hosting platforms such as Airbnb and VRBO. Next, the owners of the existing unregistered short-term rental properties would be informed and educated of the new registration process. The city would then register the new and existing short-term rental properties located in Burbank. Now, the next slide is the continuation of the same process. Once all the properties that are eligible are registered, the property owners that have not been registered that continue short-term rental activity on their properties will receive a notice of violation letter, and the host website will be contacted to have their unregistered short-term rental removed from their website. If the unregistered short-term rental activity continues, Then fines are levied, followed with review by the city attorney's office for possible further action. A weekly list of unregistered properties will be provided by the third-party consultant in order to stay up to date with properties that show up online that are not registered. And this next slide shows the main duties of the proposed short-term rental inspector. The inspector would provide ongoing outreach and education related to this proposed program. The proposed inspector would conduct drive-by inspections of short-term rental properties as needed. There would be continued review of the updated unregistered STR list in order to verify all short-term rentals in Burbank are registered, and any unregistered listings will be addressed by the inspector. Complaints received will be investigated by the proposed inspector. They will contact the host representative if issues arise. Any lack of communication or violations of registration guidelines from a registered property will receive a notice of violation, fine, suspension, revocation, as well as other enforcement tools used for unregistered short-term rentals. And that concludes the enforcement aspect of this.
Thank you, Lieutenant, and thank you, Colin, for providing us information about what we currently do during daytime and how we handle cases that are after hours, and what it's going to look like if the proposed regulations move forward allowing short-term rentals. And so that's definitely a lot of information, and I understand there's questions related to enforcement, and we want to give the opportunity for any questions that you might have. So if you do have any questions right now, you could either submit your questions through the Q&A and we could go over that, or you could choose to raise your hand through the raise hand icon on your screen, and we'll take the raise hand icon first. I see the first one, Michael. You may speak for 2 minutes. I think you're still muted. Michael, are you there? Michael, we'll get back to you. I do see another person raising their hand. The next person that I see is Chris. Chris, you have 2 minutes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Couple things. Some of the things that came out of the planning board, I believe, was concern for our single family neighborhoods. Some of the other things that came out of the planning board were concerns that other communities like La Quinta and Palm Desert have revoked permits for short-term rentals because it was ruining their communities. And some of the other things that came out of the planning board were just general concerns over enforcement. Right now, you're not allowed to have an Airbnb in Burbank. However, you can rent your house for 29 days or more. But the law is there's no Airbnb in Burbank, but yet it's happening. And our city either is not enforcing it, or Airbnb doesn't even care to honor our city's code and enforcement. So there are a lot of issues with this that I think homeowners who have paid $1 million for their home or more that are concerned that they could have a business operating next door to them of people coming in and out and ruin the quiet enjoyment of their property that they're entitled to, and that they pay $10,000, $20,000, $15,000 in taxes every year. That's why we have hotels. Hotels are places for people to go when they want a short stay. but turning our residential communities into business districts, I don't think is good for Burbank, and I think it destroys our community.
Thank you, Chris, for those two comments. The first question or comment that you had was regarding about what had happened at Planning Board, and you're right. So Planning Board, with their recommendation to get more public outreach, there was also additional information that was requested. And we'll make sure to have that additional information when presented. If we are able to complete all the requested research in advance, we'll make sure to share that information. But at this point, that information will be shared at the Planning Board meeting with the analysis and request of information that Planning Board made a motion on. And your second question was regarding single-family neighborhoods, as well as how enforcement is handled right now today. And when it comes to enforcement, right now we do handle short-term rental cases. And that's the reason why we have a code enforcement team, and that's why we have a phone number that's available to the public after hours. And so when cases do arrive, they're handled on a case-by-case basis. And I understand Lieutenant and as well as code enforcement just describe how that process looks like. Definitely, if you have more information about how that process, any of that detail is outlined today, we could talk about it. But I do want to give the opportunity for either code enforcement or police department to respond to the first question that we received. And just double checking, Chris, you mentioned about enforcement. Is there a specific question about enforcement in terms of the process today or in the future?
Well, I guess my concern is Airbnb is not permitted in the city of Burbank, but yet it's happening, and Airbnb is ignoring our current city rules, ordinances, and laws. So what makes us think that they're going to adhere to paying us fees and everything else in the future?
That's definitely a good question. And that's the reason why we included it in the proposed regulation that we're going to talk about later. There's regulations. Today, there's no regulations on those hosting platforms itself. So right now, they operate just like a business, but we don't have any mechanism to be able to tell those hosting platforms to stop any of the listings that relate to Burbank. But in this case, with the proposed regulations, it's going to say that. It's going to outline the detailed information that a hosting platform would need to provide to the city. Some example would be that as a hosting platform, once the proposed regulations are approved, and if the proposed regulation is to allow short-term rental, then there's a period of time where the hosting platform is required to contact the city and provide a contact information to us. So when a case does arrive, that we would be able to work with those hosting platforms and address any concerns if there was one regarding with a listing. Another example of proposed regulations that would impact the hosting platforms is to provide that information to us, and later on we'll get to that detail about the proposed regulations on what they would provide to the city.
Ms. Pam, we do have regulations. Our regulation is it's against the law. It's against our ordinance. It's against our code, and they're ignoring it.
Can you give me an example of the type of regulation that they're violating today?
They're operating Airbnb in Burbank and not paying any fees. They're operating Airbnb against the city's codes. Our regulation is there's no Airbnb in Burbank, but yet they're advertising and operating in the city of Burbank. So my point is, if they're doing this abruptly in our face, what makes you think that they're going to comply when we have regulations?
Chris, this is Ron Takiguchi, Assistant Director for Community Development and the City Building Official over Code Enforcement. And I'll go back to your question, Chris, and that is, why is Airbnb operating now? And as part of this ordinance, we met with Airbnb and some of the other hosting platforms, and we let them know that you are operating in our city against our existing regulation, and we're not setting up this regulation to favor them. We are setting it up as part of means to control it, as well as having the enforcement tools that we need. And Airbnb, having experience with many of the cities and other short-term rental regulations, they have assured us that with this regulation, we will comply. And they do admit that even now, without Burbank's allowance, they will work with existing short-term rentals, but they freely admit that they want to work with the city. And we feel that this ordinance gives us the tools to a practice that should not be operating, but it absolutely gives us the tools that we need to make this work. And the goal of this is to protect the neighborhoods against what is otherwise happening now.
But how are you protecting the neighborhoods? They're not complying when we have existing laws in the books. I don't understand this logic where we have existing laws in the books and they're not complying, and yet we want to let them in so that we can enforce other laws that they probably won't comply with. But yet other communities are now passing ordinances against this because it's not good for them. But yet the city of Burbank wants to look the other way because we think it's going to be better for us. I don't think so, Mr. Takiguchi.
Chris, I hear your question. Your question to city staff is, how does this proposed regulation protect single-family neighborhoods? I definitely want to get to that question, but I also want to be mindful of the other people who have questions. So I'll definitely take that question down if you don't mind. And with all the questions that we received today through the Q&A or even through the chat, we'll make sure to include it on our website. But definitely that's a really important question that you ask. If we do have more time at the end or during the meeting, we'll make sure to answer that question more clearly about how we protect single family neighborhoods with the proposed regulations.
I appreciate it. I just want other people to chime in. I just want to know, how is this good for Burbank communities and homeowners? That's what I'd like to hear. But thank you for your time this night.
Thank you, Chris. The next person that I see is Nancy. Nancy, you have 2 minutes.
Hi, thank you so much. And I just want to support Chris's comment. My name is Nancy Hanna. I work with Better Neighbors LA, and we are an organization that does watch over the enforcement of the short-term rental ordinance in the city of Los Angeles. And I do believe he's asking exactly the correct question. The issue is enforcement, because we have seen in Los Angeles the immense amount of investment and time and money that it'll actually take to enforce the ordinance. the city of Los Angeles, before our ordinance in Burbank now, does have the tools that they need to enforce their existing zoning ordinances. There's absolutely no reason that short-term rentals that are existing now and operating contrary to those regulations shouldn't be shut down. Also, the experience that we have seen in Los Angeles is what Airbnb does is they start with a simple regulation about very circumscribed of how and when short-term rentals can operate, and they use that as a wedge. And from then on, they just try to expand and expand and expand. And they've done this across the country in various other cities. And they are not a partner to cities. They have thrown up so many roadblocks in Los Angeles claiming that they can't monitor certain activities. They can't monitor when someone takes down a listing and just posts it again under a different name. They use fake addresses. The amount of investment that it takes for the city to be able to get Airbnb to actually partner and be an active participant in helping regulate their business, it's leaves a lot lacking. And so I think that if Burbank is having a problem stopping illegal short-term rentals now, it's only going to be made harder when under certain circumstances they are permitted, because you do have the tools to do it. And I think Chris is asking the right questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, hello, this is Colin from Code Enforcement. A lot of the issues that you mentioned, they're the issues that we're having now, really, is that the identification is crucial, and there's no way to identify these properties.
Right, but this short-term rental ordinance isn't going to help that. It's
No,
going to make it harder because certain people will be allowed to, other people won't, and it'll be nearly impossible to track who is violating the short-term rental ordinance because Airbnb is not going to be able to share that information with you. So this doesn't solve that problem.
Thank you, Nancy, for your comment. Did you have a specific question that you wanted me to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you haven't answered Chris's initial question is how are you going to enforce this if you haven't been able to enforce your existing zoning laws?
Sure, I can answer that question. Does someone want to speak? Sorry, Nick, was that you?
Yeah, I was going to chime in and say that the biggest tool that we can gain from our proposed program is the third-party consultant that we're planning on hiring to do the identification.
Yeah, they are not helpful at all. They take complaints and they don't follow up.
It's, we haven't chosen our third-party consultant. We're reviewing a number of third-party consultants, and the address identification is the most crucial part of that. And we are extremely confident in all the various companies' algorithms that can identify and cross-reference property records from the county and use that data to find the short-term rental operators who are not complying with our ordinance. Without that, we can't. I mean, it's just without that, it's a game of whack-a-mole. We have essentially no tools outside of neighbor complaints, and with this, we can have a system and an algorithm that can identify those who are operating illegally.
Well, I can tell you, because Los Angeles does use host compliance, and they have a hotline, and they have a website, and they have all of the tools that most cities, and probably more than most cities, are using. And my organization, we have heard over and over neighbors complaining about paid events, apartment buildings being converted into hotel rooms, entire neighborhood blocks of rent-controlled housing going to be used as short-term rentals. And they complain to the city, and it is months. Even when the city has all of the information, it's months of citations and warning letters and even fines. And none of that has stopped it yet. And so I think that these are lessons that Burbank really needs to take into consideration and have a more robust idea of how they're going to actually respond to neighbors' complaints. Because when someone's living next to a raging party house, it's not helpful to them if the person running it paid a $1,000 fine after months of getting citations. They want someone to come and shut down that house now. And how is Burbank going to have that happen?
Nancy, I'm going to respond to your question, and then we'll move forward with the workshop itself, since it's been a little over 20 minutes. Nancy, you bring up a lot of good points about how other cities are regulating short-term rentals, and each city has experienced challenges, whether it was a ban, whether it was allowing short-term rental, or allowing short-term rental with regulations across the board, regardless of how the situation is. There will be short-term rental complaints, just like complaints that we received today. The city has an operation to handle types of complaints, whether it's neighbor complaints, party complaints at night, and we address it. What the resources that we're missing today is that currently our city is operated based on a variety of complaints, and they're handled when we receive those information from the public. The proposed regulation gives us that mechanism, just like you were mentioning. There are different types of third parties that have resources to provide identification information about those listings. But you're right, there's going to be situations where someone doesn't comply. And even if you have the tools that this proposed regulation will allow, and even though you're adding regulations, there's still going to be people who don't comply. And today we don't have either the resources or the ability to respond legally with the notice of violations. And this is what the proposed regulations allow. It allows a level playing field with standards to be able to give the city resources to be able to respond. We have a minimum level of resources to be able to respond to all complaints, and we're looking for feedback with our proposed regulations on really how to define those parameters.
If the city of Burbank cannot today shut down the 300 publicly available short-term rentals existing illegally in Burbank, it's really hard to see how these different citations are going to make a difference. If you can't handle these illegal businesses operating in residential areas, how are you going to do it with this ordinance?
Yes, and when it comes to citations, I'm going to respond to the last question that you have, and we'll move forward with the workshop. When it comes to citations, the level of citations will make a difference, and that's what it outlines today. It outlines in the proposed regulations versus today, which is a minimum.
But we're talking about businesses that make upwards of 20 or 30,000 a month. How much are you going to be fining people?
You're right. There's definitely a mechanism for the legal part of it, and that's the hard part for residents to see. And when residents see that there's still short-term rentals happening, even if the neighbor had responded to the city, it's really tough for that neighbor to know what's happening on the back end. And that happens very often, where any type of complaint that the city gets, the city doesn't respond to the neighbor who submitted the complaint, but all cases are handled seriously, regardless if it's short-term rental or not short-term rental.
Okay, well, it seems like what the city of Burbank is doing is not working.
Okay.
Like Chris pointed out, it's available online. You can see hundreds of illegal short-term rentals operating.
Thank you, Nancy, for your comment. I do want to be considerate of everyone's time, and we want to move forward with the presentation with more information about the regulations. So part of the proposed regulations, it talks about the business license and registration process. What we don't have today is information about these listings. And one of the requirements that we have, if the proposed regulation moves forward, is that you have a period where you have to register for a business license. There's an annual fee for that business license. And when you register a business license, then at that point we have the name of the person who wants to operate that type of business. And that license is good for a year, and you'll have to renew it every year. With that, if you choose to move forward with your license and have a license, then you'll have a business license that you're required to post as part of your listing. So when you start seeing any, if you were to see any listings that are posted, you'll be able to identify which ones have a business license or doesn't have a business license. And with that, for every license that is issued, there's a checklist of requirements that is part of the application process to ensure that if you were to operate this business, that you have amenities and features for the guests, such as safety, knowing that you have your smoke detectors that works, and also a fire extinguisher are just some of those examples. Next slide. So for host has a set of responsibility as well. Host must be available by phone during a stay, and host must provide the city with either their own phone number or a designated person who will be present not to be present. I mean that they would be available for any issues that might arrive. Second, there wouldn't be any advertisements visible to the public on the host's property. Third, and the city would propose to have several safety provisions that the host must abide by. And those are some of the examples that I just provided. And if you're not part of a hosting platform, and if you have your own website, the regulations still apply to you, and you must remit the transit occupancy tax to the city. Next slide. Other information that the host is responsible for that's in the regulation deals with trash, making sure that there's accountability, that there is no trash visible from the street, and the host will need to provide on-site parking as well for the guests. There's also a maximum occupancy rate of no more than 2 adults per bedroom listed. At any time, the limit of number of guests would be 16, and insurance is required in order to operate a short-term rental. Next slide. When it comes to guests and host responsibility, the proposed regulation says that there are no events to be allowed, and that includes commercial events, group gatherings, and parties. It would also need to follow the noise regulation, which talks about that there's quiet hours between 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. And then regarding the transit occupancy tax, that's part of this. It's the guests that would be required to pay for the transit occupancy tax, and not the host itself. So anytime someone were to book a listing, whoever is booking that listing is the person that's paying for the TOT tax. So we have some live polling questions that we want to ask this group, and they're related to the questions that Planning Board had for us. But first we want to understand who is on the call today. And so we have our first poll question. And the first question is to ask you what best describes you. And so for this live poll question, you can select multiple choices. Nick, do you want to start the poll?
Yes. if I can figure out how to do it.
If not, I can try on my end. Let me know if you.
Yeah, could you? I
Okay.
don't see the option to do so. Sorry, everybody.
Okay.
There you go.
The live poll question is on right now, and we'll give about 30 seconds for people to respond, just so we get an idea of who is on the call at this workshop today, to better understand the response of the questions that we're going to ask. I'll give it about 5 more seconds. Okay, I'll stop there and I'll share the results so everyone is able to see who's on the call today. So today we mostly have residents and property owners as well. Nick, do you want to go to the first live poll question?
Yep.
Or the slide, if you want to move your slide.
Oh. So one of the issues raised at our planning board meeting was whether or not a homeowner or an emergency contact person would be present at the short-term rental during a guest stay. And we wanted to put this question to the audience as a live poll. Is it important that the homeowner / emergency contact person is present during the guest stay for the short-term rental? Your options are important, neutral, or not important, and we'll give you about a minute to answer the question.
Let me see. Are you able to pull up the next question? Oh, I can do it, never mind. Let me start it right now. I'll give it about 5 more seconds. Okay, I just stopped the polling question and let me share the results. So the question is it important that the homeowner emergency contact person is present during the guest stay for the short-term rental? And a majority have said that it's important. There's a percentage that said neutral and not important. Nick, do you want to go to the next question? Do you want to introduce it?
Yeah, sorry. Another issue that came up at our planning board meeting was the limit on the number of business licenses that can be issued in Burbank. And we'd like to put this question to the audience as a live poll. So Burbank has over 44,000 housing units, and the city's proposed regulations include a 900 limit on the number of business licenses that can be issued for short-term rentals in Burbank. 900 business licenses, the 900 limit represents approximately 2% of the housing stock today. What are your thoughts on this 900 limit? Is it too high, too low, or just right? And once again, we'll give you about a minute to answer the live poll.
I'll give it about 5 more seconds. Okay, I'll close the question. So the question is, Burbank has over 44,000 housing units. The city's proposed regulation includes a 900 limit on the number of business licenses that can be issued for short-term rentals. And 900 of those business licenses represents about 2% of our housing stock. And the question is, what are your thoughts on the 900 limit? There's a majority of them that says too high. So there's a percentage that says just right, and there's a percentage that says too low.
Karen, can you share the results? I don't think, there you go.
Oh, sorry about that. So thank you for your feedback on those 2 questions that came up in planning board. Nick, do you want to go to the next slide? At this time, we'll also do another public comment period just to make sure that people have the opportunity to ask questions or make a comment about short-term rentals.
And very briefly, before we call on anybody, someone in the chat asked what we are going to do with the results of these live polls. I just wanted to address that briefly. We're going to take these into consideration as we retool our proposal before we take it back to the city's planning board. The results of these polls will be, I don't want to promise that they're going to be incorporated, but they will very likely be incorporated into how we change our proposal that we bring to the city's planning board.
Thank you, Nick. And I just want to also remind the people who have questions today, we have a representative from police department, we have representative from code enforcement, and we also have representative of business license itself. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask, as well as Nick and I, who are drafting up the proposed regulations that was directed by City Council that says to allow short-term rentals, we can answer those questions as well. The next caller that I see is Jana. Jana, you have 2 minutes. Jana, we are unable to hear you. Sorry, Jana. We're still unable.
Hello?
There you go. There you go.
I don't know. I'm sorry, I didn't push allow. Going back to your original when we started today, I believe Nick said 400 to 500 listings and showed that map with all the little red dots on it. I'm understanding that is what you're saying are currently listed as short-term rentals in the city of Burbank. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So,
I wouldn't necessarily,
sorry,
to provide a little bit of context, that map is from December 2019. That's not to say that I will go back to showing that map just for a little bit of context. So that map is from 2019. I don't think necessarily that the dots are specific. It's just showing just sort of generally where short-term rentals are operating.
Yeah.
So yes.
So yeah, as Chris and Nancy were speaking earlier, I don't see how the heck you're going to be able to catch this. I was involved last year on these workshops, and that was my concern then. And I'm pretty sure that, this is like the tail wagging the dog. This is just going to be impossible to find these people. And the questions about 900 business licenses, they want to limit it to 900. What, because it seems like this is a city revenue builder is what this is really all about for me, from my perspective. I could be wrong, but, and that's fine that the city wants to build revenues. And of course our city needs money, but having 900 business licenses, which seems to be a great way to start generating some more income. If you limit it to 900, are we that naive to believe then that people will not go ahead and just keep renting their places just the way they are now? And that there'll be 900 businesses or individuals getting these business licenses, so they'll look legal, but everybody else will still be illegal. And it's just, anybody?
Well, honestly, that's one of the reasons we wanted to ask that question, because we realize that the number of these is going to be a very, I'll call it tricky number to get right. So this is one of the reasons that we wanted to put this to the community, and we are happy to hear any and all feedback, and we will take it under advisement. And, if that means lowering it to a number that's, I'm not going to promise you a number tonight, but if.
Oh, I'm not, excuse me. Yeah, Nick, I'm not saying lower it, because if I'm pretty sure that this 400 to 500 that you're showing on this map from 2019, like most things have gotten a whole lot bigger. But I just don't know how you're going to be able to track this and keep this in enforcement. And this third party that you were referencing to help ID these short-term rentals, I mean, will they be doing that before you get the proposal to the planning board, or you'll hire this third party so that the city really knows what they're looking at? And how much can you hang your hat on what these people say, that they come to you and say, yeah, we got them all, really? I don't know. Call me skeptical.
So I'm gonna, I do want to say that we are reasonably confident. I don't want to say reasonably. I think we're very confident in the ability of these third-party contractors to identify and register all of the existing short-term rentals, in part because that's what other cities have gotten out of them. And in terms of a timeline of implementation, we would hire them after we adopt any proposed ordinances adopted by the city council, and then we would have an implementation period of about 4 to 5 months after that, where the third-party contractor can run their algorithms, send out letters, do follow-up in conjunction with the city, and then get all of the existing short-term rental operators registered with a business license with the city. But your concern about the number of enforcing on the number of short-term rental operators operating both legally and illegally is appreciated, and we very much thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
The next person I see is Charlie. Charlie, you have 2 minutes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first, thank you, staff, for your efforts on this issue. My name is Charlie Carno, and I am a research analyst for Unite Here Local 11 and a tenant. And one issue that I want to address that has not really been discussed on this call is the severe impact that short-term rentals have on the rental market. As we all know, we're in a regional housing crisis, and that has made it even more difficult for Burbank renters, where we do not have as much protection as there are in some other cities. Pretty much every study of the effect of short-term rentals indicates that it can increase the price of rent, because it takes away what should be rental housing and makes it into de facto hotel use. And so I would just suggest, and I think I agree with the comments made by Mike and many, and frankly, most of the other Jana and Better Neighbors and many of the other commenters, is that, you know, I think the important thing is just to we have a very smart, simple rule, which is that short-term rentals are banned. There are hotels for people that want to stay in Burbank short-term. In fact, they are empty and are likely to suffer for a long time because business travel may not come back as, you know, folks move to virtual conferences like the one we're on now for business use. And so I think it's, you know, there's a bunch of hotels in Burbank. Frankly, there's maybe even too many on the way here. And the important thing is just to have a very simple rule that can't be messed with. That is, there are no short-term rentals, and that is not something that is allowed in the city. And folks should just go to hotels that will make sure there's no impact on the residential neighborhoods, no impact on tenants, and mean that, you know, folks come to our city and stay in the regulated places that exist to host them, hotels. So that's my comment. And I guess my question is whether or not, I guess my question for the staff is whether or not there's ever been an attempt to surge, you know, do a surge of enforcement and just try to, you know, you have 400 or 500 Airbnbs or short-term rentals you know about, just try to shut all of them down. Just do a surge of enforcement and try it. You know, it's manageable, you know, that's a manageable number to try. So.
Colin, would you be able to answer the surge question for us?
Well, I mean, what I would just say is that coming from enforcement, we're reactive when it comes to a lot of different kind of complaints. But even if we were to be proactive on it and had some kind of task force, we still would need to identify the properties. And there's no way currently that we have in our toolbox to identify the properties. Just because there's dots on a map of Burbank doesn't mean we know what addresses they are. And even when we get complaints, we still need to identify that that is the property that is in question. So it's very difficult even now when we get complaints to get evidence, let alone take it to the city attorney for prosecution if it gets to that point.
Could a simple ordinance pass just requiring that properties that offer, you know, rental services, whether they're hotels or any other use, identify who they are? You know, and so we, you know, so Airbnb sort of like anyone offering kind of a intermediary can identify the addresses. It just seems like, you know, it seems like we're sort of negotiating against ourselves here. Airbnb hides the addresses and other services hide the addresses, and so therefore we have to allow them in order to regulate them. That seems a little backwards. That's a company that's come into the city and is not enabling, you know, and has all that information. So just seems a little backwards to me.
Thank you, Charlie, for that question. We'll have to take a look at that and do research on that question, and we'll definitely respond to it as part of our Q&A that we post online. I don't know what are the parameters that could be allowed in terms of hotels and their regulations, but definitely that's a good question that we'll look into. And thank you, Chris, for your comment and your questions. I'll move on to the next caller. I see Tamala.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for this presentation this evening and for going over this material with us again. I have a few questions for you. The first one is regarding the whole program, suggested program. Has there, I think I remember hearing this before, but I just wanted to double check. Has there been a cost analysis of how much code enforcement with what you propose would cost versus how much the fees, the business fees and fines would bring in? And whether that would be negatively impacting the city, whether that would be a revenue source or how that would be from a cost perspective? That's my first question. My second question is, you know, based on what you presented to the planning board, Do you have other cities that have used similar approaches? I think it was Nick who mentioned a few minutes ago that the third-party service works in other cities with success. Would you be able to provide potentially other cities and as examples of what we can look to see how they're working well, to give the community a little bit more confidence that something like this could work because it has worked in other cities before? That's my second question. And then my third question, so this is a little bit more involved question. So one thing that you didn't present tonight is that you did present to the planning board, and is basically the kind of restrictions on when and where and how one could have an Airbnb. And I don't know if you're going to be taking that back to the drawing board or if that's still consistent with what you had presented to the planning board. But you had mentioned during that presentation that the Airbnbs would be restricted basically to single family homes or their ADUs if I understand this correctly, if the homeowner lives in that unit. So you can't Airbnb a rental unit, you have to Airbnb your own home that you live in. And that there would also be a restriction to how many days per year that one could Airbnb. And that was something like, I forget what it was, but it's something like, I want to say 100 or something like that. I can't remember the exact number, 120, okay. So what that meant to me from hearing that is basically with that set of restrictions is that is banning full-time Airbnb businesses. So anybody who wanted to buy a property or own a property and rent it out full-time would not be able to do it in Burbank. But there's these other exceptions where if you own your home and you want to rent it out for a few days, you can. So what I'm hearing from that and from our discussion tonight is that this will create an incredibly complicated enforcement necessity that you have to decide, well, is it a legal Airbnb? Is it the right, if they live in their home, do they not live in their home? Have they rented for 100 days? If they not rented for 100 days? And it is essentially a ban on Airbnbs in Burbank with some exceptions. So I guess for me, the question I have about this is how is this making it easier on the city to enforce? And how is this making it easier on neighbors to know whether their neighbor has an Airbnb? How is this making it easier on people who rent their house? Basically, this makes it harder for everybody all around. And so what I would like to see as a community member is a simpler, more straightforward decision on Airbnbs if they are banned to be banned. And then maybe have some exceptions on if you own your home, you can a few times a year, you can rent it out for under certain circumstances, or they're allowed, but they're allowed with these particular rules so that they're done in a way that is conducive to our community. And I feel like we have kind of an in-between that is neither one of those things. So I think that part of the confusion and frustration through this whole process is that it's confusing. It's not really one or the other. And I think as a community member, I would love to see a little bit more streamlining. So I'm just wondering, I guess my question is will there be a change in that portion of it? And if so, what do you expect the change could possibly be? So thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, I have one more question, the fourth one, a really quick one though. Would it be possible to have, whatever we decide to do and the planning board approves, would it be possible to have like a short term or like a 1.5 year trial period, and then after that can be reassessed? All right, thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go backwards on your questions. So a trial period on this is something that we haven't considered, so we'd have to, I think a little bit on that. A simpler, more straightforward decision on the type of regulation that we might have is something that may come out of this. It may be that only something that we are considering is allowing only, and this is essentially what the city of Santa Monica and the city of Glendale do with their regulations, is you can only rent out a part of your unit if you live on the unit or rent the unit that if it's your primary residence. That's the word that we like to use with this. So if you live if you own the unit and live there, say 8 months out of the year, and it's listed on, like, you're listed on the title of the unit, or you have a lease agreement with a landlord that will allow this, and you can only rent out a portion of your unit. That's something that we are considering going for, taking back to the city's planning board. One thing that, going back to your second question, we can provide cities where this does work. This is something that we're going to either, maybe we'll do both of these things. We'll post this in the responses to our questions that we receive in the Q&A and in the chat. So if you could put that question in the chat, that would be very helpful so that we can remember to get to it. And in terms of the cost benefit analysis, your first question, the cost benefit analysis that we did shows that it should not have a fiscal impact on the city, that the fees that we would generate from a couple hundred, even below the 400 to 500 estimated listings, should cover both the third-party contractor and hiring a code enforcement officer to help with this, or to help regulate short-term rentals.
Great, thank you. May I make one quick follow-up comment about that? As an example, Atascadero is a city that has a similar regulation that you're talking about, where you can only do Airbnb/short-term rentals if somebody lives on the property. So I think that actually is a direction that might be worth looking into, where there is some ability for someone to have essentially a small business, out of their home, where they do short-term rentals of a room or a number of rooms in their home, but that they're living on the property. So there's an investment of their own selves on the property because they're there. And that works pretty well in Atascadero. And so you might want to look at that as an example. I'm sure there's other cities that are similar. And when you see the listing on Airbnb, it actually says it's part of the home, or the owner lives on property, or they tell you kind of what you're renting out. And my family has rented there before, and it can be done in a way that's not obtrusive, and you still can enjoy your stay. So I think that might be a way to consider getting kind of best of both worlds while still keeping it simple and a little bit easier to enforce. So thank you.
Thank you for your questions and comments.
The next hand that I see is Michael. Michael, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's interesting listening to all of this. I appreciate the staff time and all of the residents' time. It's interesting, one of the staff members just talked about reporting back the success from other cities. I think it's critically important to report back the nightmares from other cities. We've heard it, we've seen it. It's been mentioned in these meetings before. And also, it's interesting that the revenue projection, when I was involved in this, the last time we went through it, we were told the revenue stream would be somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000 to the city, and the third-party cost would be around $235,000. But again, I don't think that takes into consideration all of the other services that will be stressed throughout this. It's interesting to me that we're confident that this third party that we would bring in would identify the players, and yet why don't we just hire that third party identifier now? And if we collected the fines of these 600 people that are out there, we bring in the money that we need. I was a little depressed when I heard that there is no income plus side for the city of Burbank here with Airbnbs. I look at this as another density intensifier in the R1. We've lost control. We've lost local control with the ADUs. The state took over. I don't want to lose more control in a residential neighborhood to not know who my next door neighbor is on a nightly basis. It's bad enough with the ADUs that I could have 3 families living next door with no additional parking needed. But now if it's with Airbnb, I don't know who's next door. And that's the one dear thing about Burbank. You know who your neighbors are, and you feel safe and secure. So I guess my question would be, why is it that we're not hearing more and more
about the nightmares in other cities because we know they're occurring. And lastly, this is such a large project to undertake for the 5 council members. This quite possibly should be a ballot initiative because there are good arguments for both sides, but I don't think enough people even understand what the ADUs are. I just think it's important that everybody gets their voice in this because there are people that believe in this and there are those that vehemently oppose it. Let the people decide. I mean, it's a big issue, especially when it comes to densifying and intensifying the densities in our R1 neighborhoods. Thank you so much for all the work that you guys do too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for your comment. You're right. During planning board meeting, it was also brought up to make sure that we look at various cities that had success as well as the number of issues that relate to short-term rentals. We did kind of briefly provide that information at a study session with council last year, but of course we definitely do not expect everyone to have that information available. And so on our end, we'll do our best to make sure that we provide as much data information through our website so the data information is available. And regarding your comment about the regulations itself, there is so much to talk about it. And unfortunately, we weren't able to cover all level of grounds of the proposed regulations. What we talked about today is very much the surface of what it entails. And the previous caller, just like what they mentioned, there was definitely more details when it was discussed with planning board. And so we definitely hear your comments about doing research, cost analysis, knowing that there is limited of time with these workshops. On our end, we'll do the best that we can to provide that data information to the public through our means of portal of communicating with residents regarding this issue, so you don't have to wait prior to a planning board meeting or to a city council meeting, and that information would be available in advance.
One last thing, if I may.
Yes.
You know, I've been watching this map, and when we addressed this previously, and I also watched the planning board, I think I'm now calling into question the credibility of this map. When I heard someone say, oh, it's dots, it's areas we think they are. Well, where's the substantiation behind this number and these dots? If we can't substantiate this is real, I don't think it should be part of the evidence if we think this is where they are. That doesn't hold much water with me as a constituent of trying to decide whether or not this is real. But just a comment, I think that we need to have some sort of disclaimer as to what this map represents. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And we've been hearing that comment about just wanting more information about how this software works and what it entails and what it's able to do. So we'll make sure that through communication channels that we address that question and get more detailed information for the public so they know how the system works.
Thank you.
And we do have 10 more minutes. I'm not 100% sure if this person has their hand raised, but I'll just double check. Charlie, did you have a question? Okay, it looks like there wasn't. And I do not see any more hands raised unless it was Chris. Chris, did you have a question? Let me just double check. You're allowed to talk for 2 minutes.
I'm here, thank you. You know, I was looking at some of the polling questions, and I have to say, you know, those questions are somewhat skewed because you're forcing people to answer in the affirmative. There should be a category that says opposed instead of, you know, somewhat or favorable or declined to answer. So I think it's, when you're presenting this information to council and they're reading these polls, they're reading everything in the affirmative because that's the only way you can answer these questions. So I don't think it's a fair reading of the audience and giving a poll that's accurate.
Thank you, Chris, for that question and comment. And you bring up a really good point that I want to clarify in this workshop. This topic came up with City Council last year, and the direction that City Council chose to make was to see how a proposed regulation would look like to allow short-term rentals. And that was the direction provided to city staff. And so the questions that were asked today and at our previous workshops goes in that direction to make sure that we're able to respond to City Council's requests. And that's the reason why those questions are set up in a way where it's more affirmative to allow short-term rentals. If there was another direction, we could definitely make sure to tailor those questions in that regard.
I think staff has done an excellent job trying to present short-term rentals in a positive light, but I'd also like to see a staff report showing the negative sides of short-term rentals so that way people can make a fair decision. I just don't see a very balanced effort in these projections, these numbers, and these reports. And I think that you have to work both sides equally and fair so that people have the correct information, because there's a lot of information out there, as the previous caller said, nightmare stories about short-term rentals, but we're not seeing any of that information. And I don't think that our community can make a balanced decision without that information. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris. We are hearing that comment, and so we'll make sure to best provide as much data information. Just to make sure that I finish the last slides that are shown on the screen right now. During this process, we are working with hosting platforms to get a better understanding of their they use. Just give me 1 second. And we are also looking at other cities. Throughout this process, since City Council has provided us this direction, we've been communicating with neighboring cities in a continuous basis to make sure that we have a full understanding about how regulations have impacted their community. We've also talked to cities who are in the process of writing their regulations, those cities that are trying to implement their regulations. And we've also have been in contact with cities who are banning regulations, and we'll make sure to include that information to you guys. With this, there is a process where we are going to go back to planning board to present an updated proposed regulations based on community feedback. And we're anticipating that to be in a couple of months. And then from there, when a decision is made, it'll be presented to City Council in summer of this year is what we're aiming for. But definitely during this time, we are continuing to do our research to make sure that whatever is presented, that it is a regulation that helps protect our neighborhoods while allowing people to be able to operate their businesses here in Burbank. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for attending. All these meetings are really important to us, and we want to make sure that we have an open communication with all of you. If you want to understand more about code enforcement, the proposed regulations, or any of the process to this. And so feel free to reach out to Nick or myself with our contact information. and we'll make sure to post more information on our website, which is burbankca.gov/str. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions. We definitely have more Q&A questions through our Zoom link, and we'll make sure to post response to you on that website. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.